I'm John McKee, editor of Messianic Apologetics. Messianicapologetics.net. I'm John McKee, editor of Messianic Apologetics. Messianicapologetics.net. And I would like to welcome you to this episode of Messianic Insider, your theology and news roundup for October the 30th, 2025. Now, we do have some important news to go through later in our live stream, but as I announced yesterday, we were going to have a longer teaching, and this teaching has been taken from our ministry publication. Get the theology banner up there. The Messianic Kosher Helper. And we're going to be discussing Galatians 2:11 through 14. Now, Galatians 2:11 through 14 is a difficult passage for many Messianic people to sort through, and many don't quite know what to do about it. Was the confrontation in Antioch between Paul and Peter actually over the Apostle Peter adhering to the dietary laws? Was it the Apostle Peter pulling away from the non-Jewish believers and rupturing what was supposed to be a unified fellowship mealtime? What does it mean to live like the Jews, or more literally, Judaize? This is a loaded passage. It's something which does confuse a lot of Messianic people. It involves elements of both a review of the kosher laws as well as a review of the intended unity between Jewish and non-Jewish believers in the body of Messiah. So we're going to be going through a lot today, and just keep that in mind. Galatians 2:11 through 14 has translation issues, background issues, etc. All right, so let's switch screens really quickly. Oh, it did not work. All right, we will try this again. Nope. Okay. We'll try it one more time. Okay, good. Excellent. All right, so Galatians 2:11 through 14. Paul confronts Peter in Antioch, and this is from our Messianic Kosher Helper. Some of you all are aware that I'm presently in the middle right now of updating the Galatians for the Practical Messianic Commentary. That'll be hopefully available sometime early 2026. But here are the verses, Galatians 2:11 through 14. And I will note for you, MARV, that's an abbreviation of Messianic Apologetics Revised Version. That is an modified edition of the public domain World Messianic Bible, formerly known as the Hebrew Names Version. Galatians 2:11 through 14, our passage. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before some people came from James, he ate with the nations. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they did not walk uprightly according to the truth of the good news, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, being a Jew, live like the nations do, and not like the Jews, how do you compel the nations to Judaize? Galatians 2:11 through 14. And as I said, this is from the Messianic Apologetics Revised Version, which is just my modified version of the public domain World Messianic Bible. And obviously, there are some renderings here which some of you all have perhaps never seen before, because they are affected by different interpretations of this passage. Paul's letter to the Galatians is easily recognized to be the most difficult book of the Bible for generally all people within today's Messianic movement. Understandably, those aspects of Galatians where the Torah or law of Moses or issues like circumcision and proselytism are directly addressed receive more attention than other parts of the letter. The incident which took place between the apostles Peter and Paul in Antioch, seen in Galatians 2:11 through 14, certainly does feature in a great deal of Christian discussion over why the Torah's dietary code has apparently been abrogated for the post-resurrection era. Galatians 2:11 through 14 can often be referenced in terms of kashrut needing to be abolished in order for table fellowship to be restored between the Jewish and non-Jewish believers. Yet, as one will be able to see, whether the actual issue which caused the schism was the fare served at fellowship meal gatherings can be disputed. Just surveying Galatians 2:11 through 14, it is easily recognized how an outside group entered in among the Messiah followers in Antioch. They interjected some kind of instability. Divisions between the Jewish and non-Jewish believers were taking place, and Peter was publicly confronted by Paul for being in error. There are Galatians interpreters who will posit the composition of Paul's letter after the Jerusalem Council of Acts 15, and who feel that the Apostle Peter was violating what was agreed upon for the inclusion of the non-Jewish believers. Acts 15, 20, 29. Other interpreters posit the composition of Galatians before the Jerusalem Council, and that it was only with the conference being convened that a uniform agreement was in place regarding the non-Jews entering into the ecclesia. A common interpretation of Galatians 2:11 through 14, as is seen among many examiners, is that prior to the arrival of the outsiders from Jerusalem, the Apostle Peter would eat with the non-Jewish believers and, as such, would eat non-kosher meat. Upon their arrival, he was errantly influenced, starting eating kosher again, and in order for fellowship to be restored, the non-Jews in Antioch would have to start eating kosher themselves. An alternative interpretation of Galatians 2:11 through 14, as is detected among various other examiners, posits that due to the already high integration of non-Jews as God-fearers in the synagogues of Antioch, that a fair number of the non-Jewish believers probably already kept some level of a kosher or kosher-style diet. The separation of Peter from these believers was not over the menu at fellowship meals, but rather the fact that the non-Jews had not been circumcised as proselytes. In order for harmony to ensue among the body of Messiah, the non-Jewish believers would have to become formal Jewish proselytes. While there has been little detailed Messianic examination of Galatians 2:11 through 14 with the topic of kosher in mind, it is more or less detectable that the alternative view of Peter's separation being caused by the non-Jewish believers not being proselytes is seen among various resources. Galatians 2:11. Having just described how there was some unity between himself and the Messianic Jewish leaders at Jerusalem, per Paul's unique mission among the nations, Galatians 2:1 through 10, Paul now told the Galatians about an incident which took place when Peter had come to visit the believers in Antioch. Bible readers do not know anything else about this visit other than what Paul recorded. We do not know when Peter visited Antioch and whether this was a touch and go visit with Peter in transit to another place or an intentional visit to Antioch with plans to return to Jerusalem. It may have been that after his arrest and being freed from the angel, that in going to Caesarea, Peter continued on to Antioch. Acts 12:19b. Richard N. Longenecker notes, quote, "There is much in 2:11 through 14 that we are not told about the situation at Antioch, and much of what we are told is mostly by way of allusion," unquote. Longenecker does go on, though, in discussing the composition of the assembly, that it may be widely assumed how there was a singular group of believers and that their fellowship times were apparently quite regular. Quote, "Was it one congregation made up of both Jewish and Gentile believers? Were there two congregations, one Jewish and the other Gentile? Or were there a number of congregations meeting at various places in the city, some ethnically mixed and others not? The impression given by Paul is of one group composed of both Jews and Gentiles, and such an impression seems in line with what we know of Jewish-Gentile relations at Antioch at the time," unquote. Even though readers may lack a complete picture of the setting, this should not deter us from understanding Paul's point to the Galatians and how Peter had broken the private agreement made between Paul and the Jerusalem leaders. This private agreement involved the Greek Titus not being compelled to be circumcised as a believer in Israel's Messiah in order to be welcome as a fellow brother in faith, Galatians 2:3. As a private agreement, we must remember that the requirements which would later be laid out by the Jerusalem Council, a public forum, specifically relating to blood and strangled meats, Acts 15:20, had yet to be formalized. Hence, when Peter visited Antioch and a scene erupted during one of the assembly meals, he may have claimed some kind of deniability. Likewise, in Galatians 2:12, we also must consider that Paul said nothing specific about the kind of food served during these meals. Was the meal elaborate, or was it simple? How much or how little observance of kashrut was taking place? When Peter separated himself from the non-Jewish believers, would he have done so even if bread and water were all which were served? This is where examiners diverge in opinion. Paul recalled to the Galatians, "When Kepha came to Antioch, I opposed him publicly because he was clearly in the wrong." Galatians 2:11, Complete Jewish Bible. Here, prosopon auto antestein is more correctly, "I opposed him to his face." Revised Standard Version, New Revised Standard, English Standard Version, New American Standard, et al. This was likely affected by various Tanakh passages when the outcome of a situation was very critical. In Deuteronomy 7:24, for example, Moses said, "He will deliver their kings into your hand, and you shall make their name perish from under the sky. No one will be able to stand before you until you have destroyed them." World Messianic Bible. The Hebrew ish b'panecha is literally rendered as man in with face, as it regarded the defeat of Israel's enemies as the people marched into the promised land. In a similar manner, could Paul at all have been making an allusion that as this new chapter in salvation history was opening, Peter's actions demonstrated how there would be, at the very least, tension and most probably resistance to the spread of the good news among the nations. Why would Peter, as Paul put it, have stood self-condemned, New Revised Standard? Obviously, part of it related to his violation of the private agreement as one of the Jerusalem leaders with Paul to recognize the evangelization of the nations as valid. We also need to consider some of the social ramifications and the widespread historical political climate among Jewish communities of the first century. Various examiners today draw attention to the fact that the Jewish people, on the whole, felt threatened by external forces, beginning with the Seleucid Greek invasion of the 160s BCE to the Roman occupation of Judea in the 40 CE. An entire series of events helped fuel Jewish xenophobia toward Greeks and Romans, including, but by no means limited to, Caligula insisting that a statue of himself be set up in the Jerusalem temple, 40 CE, a series of poor Roman governors and administrators, 44 to 46 CE, and the demand that the vestments of the high priest be held for safekeeping by the Romans. Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews 20, 1 through 9. When one adds to this the challenges caused by the Zealot movement and increasingly disparate relations with Rome, at the very least, it can be seen how many Jews would have wanted to remain constrained to themselves and limited in their contact with others. These events were all contemporary to the Antioch incident and Paul writing Galatians. James D.G. Dunn summarizes how these events probably affected the early Jewish believers. Quote, "The followers of Jesus within Palestine would not have been unaffected by these mounting pressures. The death of Stephen and the subsequent persecution, early or middle 30s, presumably had the effect of ensuring that those followers of the Nazarene who had been exempted from the persecution or had returned to Jerusalem thereafter would take care to show themselves good Jews, loyal to their religious and national heritage." Unquote. From his resource, Jesus, Paul, and the Law, Studies in Mark and Galatians. Some of these factors indicate, as Dunn further states, how, quote, "Many Jewish believers took it as axiomatic that Gentiles must be circumcised if they were to have a share in the Jewish heritage, and were prepared to exercise considerable advocacy and missionary endeavor to ensure that heritage was neither diluted nor endangered." Unquote. Also from Jesus, Paul, and the Law. When these things are taken into consideration, one should more easily understand some of the negative attitudes which various Jewish believers displayed toward the non-Jewish believers. Many of them probably thought that short of proselyte conversion, that non-Jews should not be allowed into the assembly. Likewise, many of them would have been hostile to Paul, who taught that the entryway into God's people was faith in Israel's Messiah and in what he had accomplished, as opposed to more national and or sectarian identity markers, Galatians 2:16. Yet, in spite of some of the justified skepticism which may have existed, the prejudices and phobias about the nations were not to be found in the divine mandate issued by God in the Torah. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Genesis 12:3, New International Version. The reason why Peter stood self-condemned after withdrawing himself from his non-Jewish brethren, Galatians 2:12, was largely because he violated some of the very principles he should have stood up for. Before Peter even visited Antioch, or Paul visited the Jerusalem leaders, Peter had already been accused of eating with uncircumcised, ungodly people by his fellow Jewish believers. Luke records in Acts 11, 1 through 3, the reaction Peter received after visiting the God-fearing centurion Cornelius. Now the emissaries and the brothers who were in Judea heard that the Gentiles had also received the word of God. When Peter had come up to Jerusalem, those who were of the circumcision contended with him, saying, "You went in to uncircumcised men and ate with them." Acts 11, 1 through 3, World Messianic Bible. Those who were circumcised is most likely referring to a group of very conservative Jewish believers, New Living Translation, and not those who had undergone ritual proselyte conversion. However, rather than tell his accusers that he was somehow in the wrong, Peter instead recounted the vision of the sheet God showed him, Acts 11, 4 through 10, also 10, 9 through 16. Peter's own interpretation of this vision, as he told Cornelius, was, "God has shown me that I should not call any man common or unclean." Acts 11:28, Revised Standard Version. After Peter testified to what happened regarding the salvation of Cornelius's household, Acts 11, 11 through 17, also 10, 17 through 48, those who had accused him rejoiced and saw that God was doing something new. When they heard these things, they held their peace and glorified God, saying, "Then God has also granted to the Gentiles repentance to life." Acts 11:18, World Messianic Bible. By separating himself from his non-Jewish brothers and sisters in Antioch, Peter stood self-condemned because he violated the very things which began the Gentile mission, his vision of the sheet and the proclamation of the good news to Cornelius. Paul opposed Peter in Antioch for withdrawing from the table and his non-Jewish brethren in a way similar to how Moses opposed Pharaoh, Exodus 8:20, and Joshua was promised by God to have no opposition, Joshua 1:5. Some have likened Paul's opposition of Peter to an ancient legal trial. Josephus describes some of the emotions from an ancient trial which Paul may have expressed at this incident. They dispense their anger after a just manner and restrain their passion. They are eminent for fidelity and are the ministers of peace. Whatever they say also is firmer than an oath, but swearing is avoided by them, and they esteem it worse than perjury. For they say that he who cannot be believed without swearing by God is already condemned. Wars of the Jews 2, 135. Galatians 2:12. The scene which erupted in Antioch was noted by Paul in his letter to the Galatians. For before certain people came from Jacob, he regularly ate with the Gentiles. But when they came, he came to withdraw and separate himself, fearing those of the circumcision. Galatians 2:12, Tree of Life version. Prior to the arrival of outsiders from the Messianic Jewish community in Jerusalem, the Apostle Peter made it his habit to eat with the non-Jewish believers in Antioch. In the estimation of John R.W. Stott, quote, his old Jewish scruples had been overcome. He did not consider himself in any way defiled or contaminated by contact with uncircumcised Gentile Christians, as once he would have done. Instead, he welcomed them to eat with him and he with them, unquote. The importance of eating alongside the non-Jewish believers was quite tangible, not just as a sign that in the Messiah, Jews and non-Jews were equal brothers and sisters, but perhaps even more so because Peter was one of the main apostles. Galatians 2:9. G. Walter Hansen properly observes, quote, undoubtedly, his presence at table fellowship with Gentile Christians was taken as an official stamp of approval on the union and equality of Jews and Gentiles in the assembly. We can imagine that the Gentile believers in the assembly were especially encouraged by Peter's wholehearted acceptance of them, unquote. while the Apostle Peter was opposed by the Apostle Paul for his behavior. Galatians 2:11. Peter eating with the non-Jewish believers was in accord with what God had shown him in the Acts 10 vision of the sheet and subsequent visit to Cornelius. As F.F. Bruce confirms, this, quote, is in complete accord with the picture given of him in Acts, where, after learning on Simon the tanner's rooftop in Joppa not to call anyone unclean whom God has cleansed, he is happy to visit Cornelius in Caesarea and eat with him and his family. Acts 10:28, 11:3, unquote. The presence of outsiders in Antioch caused a change in behavior. Paul stated the reason why Peter separated himself. Before certain men came from James, he ate with the Gentiles, but when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. Galatians 2:12, Revised Standard Version. The Greek speaks of Elthein, Tinas, Apa, Iakobu, coming of certain from James, Young's literal translation. And who these individuals were specifically is not agreed upon by expositors. It is not agreed whether or not these people were actually from James, were just associated with James in some way, or claimed that they came from James. This is further compounded by those who believe that Paul and the Jerusalem assembly were generally in agreement, mostly conservatives or evangelicals, or those who believe that Paul and the Jerusalem assembly were at constant odds with one another, mostly liberals. Some might suggest that the certain men from James were sent to moderate possible disputes, as it is notable how James himself did accede approval to Paul for his mission among the nations, Galatians 2:9, and was the very person Paul desired to interview after his coming to faith, Galatians 1:19. This would mean that the certain men from James coming was actually a good thing. David H. Stern renders Galatians 2:12 in his Complete Jewish Bible with, prior to the arrival of certain people from, open bracket, the community headed by, close bracket, Yaakov, indicating that there is some difference in how to view the verse. But even if one assumes that the arrival of these individuals from James was a good thing, and they represented James in his approval of Paul's mission, their arrival was nevertheless what caused Peter's inappropriate attitude and behavior to surface. Many do think that these individuals, even if genuinely sent by James, overstepped their mandate. Check later in Acts 15:24. In discussing the relationship of the dietary laws to the scene in Galatians chapter 2, the entry on food offered to idols and Jewish food laws in the dictionary of Paul and his letters by B.B. Blue summarizes a widespread evangelical Protestant conclusion that the certain men from James had in fact overstepped whatever directions James had given them. Quote, we should be cautious not to associate their position too closely with that of James. After all, James certainly voiced disapproval over their conduct, Acts 15:24. It is probable that they had exceeded the terms of their commission. Paul states that before certain men came from James, Peter was in the habit of regularly eating with Gentile Christians. Nevertheless, the presence of these Jewish Christians from the circumcision party caused Peter to begin to withdraw from his regular practice altogether, unquote, from the Dictionary of Paul and his letters. Scott McKnight further says, quote, I suspect that they were truly from James, though they may not have been representing James with full integrity, unquote. Those who arrived in Antioch are thought to be the same who would say in Acts 15:1, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Tree of Life version. While Peter had his fears about those of the circumcision party, tous ek peritomes, and the issue was initially table fellowship and communion among fellows. By the time the Jerusalem Council had to meet, things had apparently gone beyond just inclusion within the people of God, and things had decisively become salvation-oriented, as would be relayed to the believers in Antioch from the Jerusalem Council. We have heard that some of our number, to whom we gave no instruction, have confused you by their teaching, upsetting your souls. Acts 15:24, 2020 New American Standard. Previously in Galatians 2:2-10, Paul had taken great pains to express that James, Peter, and John all approved of his evangelistic activities, including giving him and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, Galatians 2:8. Later, James was the one at the Jerusalem Council who made the final ruling regarding the non-Jewish believers coming to faith, Acts 15:19-21, indicating that ritual circumcision would not be necessary for them to enter into the ecclesia. So why were those of James's party instigating Peter's separation from his non-Jewish brethren? The New American Standard renders Galatians 2:12 with, he began, in italics, to withdraw for the imperfect verb hupestellen, or withdrawing. The Brown and Comfort Interlinear has was separating. As Donald K. Campbell describes it, quote, the verb tense is imperfect, indicated gradual withdrawal, perhaps from one joint meal a day and then two, or it may be that he began a meal with Gentiles but finished it with only Jewish Christians, unquote. Bruce concurs, quote, he did not make an abrupt break with his former practice, but proceeded to change it gradually, unquote. So, while a scene took place between Peter and Paul in Antioch, it did not happen instantaneously. It is not as though on one day Peter just got up from eating with some non-Jewish believers, moving over to an area with Jewish believers. His withdrawing himself started off slowly and then became more regular. It reached a point of contention when Paul finally asked him what he was doing, violating the very revelation God had given him. The New Jerusalem Bible depicts this as he backed out and kept apart from them. The improper actions of Peter are well summarized by the verb aphorizo, to remove one party from other parties so as to discourage or eliminate contact, by the BDAG lexicon. But why would Peter have done this? Was he just throwing out the revelation God had given him regarding the cleansing of the nations? Acts 10:11. Stott interjects the important observations. Quote, are we to suppose that Peter had now forgotten the vision at Joppa and the conversion of the household of Cornelius, or that he now went back on the revelation that God had given him then? Surely not. There is no suggestion in Galatians 2 that Peter had changed his mind. Why then did he withdraw from fellowship with the Gentile believers in Antioch? Paul tells us he separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. Verse 12, unquote. Peter was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group, New International Version. And while later it is made clear that the individuals from James went too far, Acts 15:24, some of the initial reasons why they advocated circumcision of the non-Jewish believers as proselytes were likely political, as summarized by Hansen. Quote, it seems that during the late 40s and 50s, Jewish Christians in Judea were facing bitter antagonism from zealot-minded Jews for socializing with Gentiles. The fierce Jewish nationalism rampant in Palestine at that time led to harsh treatment of any Jew who associated with Gentiles. It is likely that the delegation from James simply reported to Peter that his open and unrestricted association with Gentiles in Antioch would cause, or had already caused, the assembly in Jerusalem to suffer greatly at the hands of the circumcision group, Jewish nationalists, unquote. The challenge, of course, is in recognizing that those sent from James apparently had some of those same views, even to the point of them ultimately making circumcision a salvation issue. Acts 15:1. It is not difficult at all to understand that when Peter separated himself, Revised Standard Version, problems could easily have started erupting between the Jewish and non-Jewish believers in Antioch. The very thing which, in terms of Paul's overall message to the Galatians, he did not want to see happen in Galatia. This would occur if the false teachers they were facing continued to lead people astray by similarly insisting that non-Jewish believers had to be circumcised as proselytes in order to be fully reckoned as members of God's people and or eternally redeemed. In a point of weakness, Bible readers see Peter succumbing to peer pressure. During the moment Paul described, Peter could have been worried about his reputation should he have returned to Jerusalem and word get out that he had eaten a meal with non-Jewish believers, which would have offended the overly conservative faction which demanded their circumcision. When Peter returned to Jerusalem, major criticism and disrepute for the expanding mission among the nations could have occurred, perhaps even with warnings being issued about Paul's gospel of faith, by accusing Peter in public, presumably before these individuals. Paul could have deterred some major controversies before they began. In a dramatic way, he had to remind Peter what they all agreed about concerning his mission among the nations. Galatians 2:13. It would seem that Paul only took action when the other Jews joined Peter in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. Galatians 2:13, New International Version. The verb sunu pakrinomai means to play a part along with others, from the Liddell Scott lexicon. Bruce renders this as play acting, New International Greek Testament Commentary, as Peter's separation set a very bad example for all of the Jewish believers in Antioch. So bad was this example that even Paul's associate in ministry, Barnabas, was affected. Table fellowship was very important in the ancient world. And so it is no surprise why Paul was so disturbed at the lack of interaction between the Jewish and non-Jewish believers in Antioch, for which Peter was directly responsible. How we understand what was going on in Antioch and properly apply it today as Messianics is being affected by some of the proposals of the new perspective of Paul in theological studies, among others, which better attempt to understand Paul in his Jewish context. First of all, it is important to consider the specific significance of table fellowship in ancient Judaism. The Mishnah summarizes. Rabbi Simeon says, 3 who ate at a single table and did not talk about teachings of Torah while at that table are as though they ate from dead sacrifices. Psalm 106:28. As it is said, for all tables are full of vomit and filthiness if they are without God. Psalm 106:28. But 3 who ate at a single table and did talk about teachings of Torah while at that table are as if they ate at the table of the omnipresent, blessed is he, as it is said. And he said to me, this is the table that is before the Lord. Ezekiel 41:22. Mishnah Avot 3:3. The implication here implies that proper table fellowship has discussion which is focused around God and his word. Surely, it is not a far stretch to conclude that the conversations going on during the meals in Antioch were focused around the Lord. But another major factor which would have affected how the Jewish and non-Jewish believers would have fellowshipped during meals would have been much more than table conversation, but would have pertained to the meals themselves. Since the Maccabean revolt, 1 Maccabees 1, 62 and 63, the need for loyal Jews to eat kosher was not just considered obedience to the Torah, but also a matter of national preservation. At these times of fellowship, the Jewish believers would have been concerned about the type of meat served, whether the meat was tainted by idolatry, and the matter of butchering. Is it impossible to conclude that just to get the Jewish believers to sit down with the non-Jewish believers, some level of kashrut had to be considered? Nothing specific is mentioned in the text regarding the type of food served at these meals, but these meals were regular occurrences, and it is doubtful that they were all vegetarian. Hans Dieter Betz generally says, quote, "Nothing is said whether these meals were ordinary meals or celebrations of the Lord's Supper or both. The point of concern is the Jewish purity requirements which must be observed whatever meals were involved." Unquote. He goes on to state, though, quote, "The issue at stake was not Cephas's breaking a fellowship, but first participation in and subsequent withdrawal from the meal, but his shifting attitude with regard to the Jewish dietary and purity laws." Unquote. It is commonly concluded among a variety of Christian examiners that what divided the believers in Antioch was the meal which was being served at the fellowship gatherings, and that Peter had improperly drifted back into keeping kosher. As is summarized by Beverly R. Gaventa, quote, "Despite the fact that Paul says Peter and the others withdrew from eating with Gentiles, it is probably not the identity of the diners, but the character of the menu that proved divisive. Those who carefully followed Jewish law found eating with Gentiles difficult, not because fellowship with Gentiles was inherently objectionable, but because the food offered would not conform to dietary laws." Unquote. McKnight takes an improper liberty in trying to relay his conclusion of what was going on in Antioch. Quote, "Peter was probably eating baby back barbecued spare ribs or shrimp scampi, and the more conservative Jews took issue with his cavalier violation of the law. There was now, in effect, two churches, a kosher church and a Gentile church." Unquote. The kind of statement which communicates Peter eating baby back ribs or shrimp scampi unnecessarily complicates an objective first century reading of Galatians 2, 11 through 14. Bruce is much fairer in his assertion, quote, "At the ensuing Jerusalem Council, against some opposition, circumcision must not be required of Gentile Christians, but that they should undertake to conform to the most important Jewish food restrictions, in particular, the avoidance of the flesh of pagan sacrifices and a flesh from which the blood had not been drained, and the Jewish code of regulations between the sexes." Unquote. While today's Messianic people should not be surprised to see various Christian examiners of Galatians conclude that the issue of Peter's separation was over the fare served, we should be a bit taken aback at the conclusion drawn by David H. Stern in his Jewish New Testament commentary over the thought that when interacting with non-Jews such as those in Antioch, it would have been a more or less regular practice for a figure like Peter to eat non-kosher things. As Stern puts it, quote, "To live Messianic Jewishly means sometimes to live Goyishly from the viewpoint of a non-Messianic Jew. Why? Because of the way in which the Torah has been modified under the new covenant to take into account the inclusion of Gentiles in God's people. Thus, the Torah-true Messianic Jew may break the laws of kashrut for the sake of preserving Jewish-Gentile fellowship in the body of Messiah, and the Torah-true Messianic Gentile may sometimes choose to eat kosher for the same reason. Unquote. From the Jewish New Testament commentary. While there are times where eating non-kosher things is necessary, it is often via the imperative of, into whatever city you enter and they receive you, eat the things that are set before you. Luke 10:8, World Messianic Bible. Or, but if one of those who don't believe invites you to a meal and you are inclined to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no questions for the sake of conscience. 1 Corinthians 10:27, World Messianic Bible. The setting of the Jewish and non-Jewish believers in Antioch was one of their regular fellowship meals, most likely associated with a time of worship and teaching, not a time where a figure like Peter, Paul, or Barnabas was testifying of Yeshua in the home of a Greek or Roman non-believer. Not all present examiners are agreed that the issue in Galatians 2:11 through 13, with the Apostle Peter separating himself from the non-Jewish believers in Antioch, was it all over him apparently only fellowshipping with those who ate kashrut. Instead, it has been suggested that given the high degree of interaction and integration of non-Jewish people within the Jewish community of Antioch, as God-fearers, that they would have kept some level of kashrut, perhaps with an overall kosher style of diet observed by the believers. Divisions occurred among those being relatively moderate, the non-Jewish believers, and one quite stringent, the men from James. Or, what is much more of a factor from the text is that Peter was regularly socializing with uncircumcised non-Jewish believers. Richard B. Hayes describes, quote, "The law of Moses contains no prohibition of eating with Gentiles. The people of Israel were commanded to abstain from unclean foods and from meat or wine tainted by association with idolatry. But as long as certain fundamental dietary precautions were observed, there was no reason why even strictly Torah-observant Jews could not share table fellowship with Gentiles. It is possible that the food at the common meals was not kosher, that Peter and other Jewish Christians were disregarding basic Jewish dietary laws by eating meat with blood in it, or pork and shellfish. On the other hand, it seems unlikely that such flagrant violation of Jewish norms would have been practiced at Antioch, particularly if the Gentile converts were drawn primarily from the ranks of the God-fearers, who presumably have already assimilated to Jewish dietary practices. It is more probable that the men from James were objecting to the practice of associating with Gentiles at table." Unquote. Some kind of kosher food would have had to be present in order for the Jewish believers to really be there, eating at the meals. Dunn notes a significant interpretation option for Galatians 2:12, which has probably not been given enough publicity among contemporary Christian readers. Quote, "Peter and the other Jewish believers were sharing table fellowship with Gentile believers on less clearly defined Jewish terms. That is, not only welcoming Gentiles to their table, but accepting invitations to Gentile tables without asking too many questions. 1 Corinthians 10:27. Though presumably on the assumption that the Gentile believers would have been mindful of the basic food rules. The James people, having come to Antioch to visit primarily the Jewish believers, 2:9, would then have been shocked at the degree of laxness being shown by these Jewish believers and criticized them accordingly." Unquote. The level of kosher observed among the Antioch believers would have been a basic kosher-style diet, which avoided pork, shellfish, blood, etc. It was probably not up to the same standard as many of the Jerusalem believers would have observed, but it was likely normative for the level of exchange between Jewish people and those considered God-fearers in the Mediterranean diaspora. That a kosher or kosher style of meal was indeed served at the fellowship meal gatherings, and not pork or shellfish, certainly not baby back ribs or shrimp scampi, as McKnight put it, among other things, is deduced from how the first century historian Josephus recorded how in this region the Jewish race, densely interspersed among the native populations of every portion of the world, is particularly numerous in Syria, where intermingling is due to the proximity of the two countries. But it was at Antioch that they especially congregated. Moreover, they were constantly attracting to their religious ceremonies multitudes of Greeks, and these had in some measure incorporated with themselves. Wars of the Jews 7:43-45. The thought of Dunn is that, quote, though there were clear boundary lines between Jew and Gentile, marked out not least by the food laws and the complex of traditional attitudes and practices gathered round them, there were many Gentiles who were eager to cross these boundaries to at least some extent, and who were welcomed by Jews when they did so, unquote. It would seem probable that with many of the Jewish believers in Antioch, having already been integrated into the Jewish community, even as God-fearers prior to encountering Paul and the good news of Yeshua, that they were already used to a certain level of kosher eating. Some level of kashrut was probably observed in Antioch, but a slight liberalizing of the kosher dietary restrictions because of the mixed community of Jewish and non-Jewish believers could have incurred some rebukes from the individuals sent by James, which then only inflamed an apparent need of why figures like Peter should have separated from non-proselytes. The eating in view had to have been consistent with the later Acts 15 ruling of meat from proper animals with the blood drained, Acts 15:20-29. Yet this may not have been the higher level of kashrut adhered to by the Jerusalem party, with whom Peter was associating, for which eating kosher may have been more than just observing biblical commandments, Leviticus 11, Deuteronomy 14, but an issue of national identity. Secondly, and far more important, is how interpreters consider the ongoing debates in Second Temple Judaism about whether or not Jewish people could even sit down with non-Jews at the table to conduct affairs. Some discussion in the Mishnah indicates that, with few stipulations, a Jewish person could sit down with a non-Jewish person to eat and talk. If an Israelite was eating with a Gentile at the same time, and he put a flagon of wine on the table and a flagon on a side table, and he left it and went out, what is on the table is forbidden, but what is on the side table is permitted. And if he had said to him, you mix and drink wine, even that which is on the side table is forbidden. Jars which are open are forbidden, and those which are sealed are forbidden if he was gone for a time sufficient to bore a hole and stop it up and for the clay to dry. Mishnah Avodah Zarah 5:5. While this quotation indicates that Jewish and non-Jewish people could interact at a table, it is to be contrasted with the decree, dwelling places of Gentiles in the land of Israel are unclean, Mishnah Oholot 18:7, which largely forbade any Jewish and non-Jewish interaction. And as the Roman historian Tacitus indicates, the common Gentile response to these sorts of views was not that much better. Whatever their origin, these observances are sanctioned by their antiquity. The other practices of the Jews are sinister and revolting and have entrenched themselves by their very wickedness. The Histories 5:5, 1, and 2. These are exactly the kinds of attitudes that which undoubtedly wanted to see reversed in Antioch and did not want to see settle themselves in Galatia. Paul wanted both Jewish and non-Jewish believers to come together as one people in Yeshua, fellowshipping together and uplifting him and his grace. In the case of Antioch, the ungodly attitudes were being displayed from the Jewish segment of the believers. By separating himself away from his non-Jewish brothers and sisters, Peter would have been favoring the more conservative of the halakhic options noted, limiting or forbidding table fellowship. As Paul put it, he was fearing the party of the circumcision, Galatians 2:12, New American Standard. Aside from the fact that Peter knew from previous experience, all the circumcised believers who came with Peter were astonished because of the gift of the Ruach HaKodesh had been poured out even on the Gentiles. Acts 10:45, Tree of Life version. He gave into some of the social pressures which were common to the time within much of the Jewish community. Some level of kosher, clean meats without blood, may have very well been observed in Antioch, but the significant majority of the non-Jewish believers had not gone through ritual proselyte conversion. And then a problem ensued when those from Jerusalem arrived. Galatians 2:14. Paul held all of the Jewish believers who separated from the non-Jewish believers in Antioch responsible for not being straightforward about the truth of the gospel. Galatians 2:14, New American Standard, or not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, New Revised Standard. But Peter was specifically targeted as having been in error. Paul's accusation before Peter in Galatians 2:14 was that he was living like the Gentiles, New American Standard. How this is to be interpreted in light of the clauses which are witnessed has been vigorously debated in recent scholarship and is probably one of the hardest parts of the Bible for most Messianic people to understand. While Peter was publicly rebuked for his actions by Paul, seemingly in front of all of the Antioch believers, surely Paul would have followed the Matthew 18:15 imperative. If your brother sins against you, go show him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained back your brother. World Messianic Bible. It is quite possible that some kind of private encounter between Paul and Peter had already been conducted, with or without success. At the same time, if Peter's separation from the non-Jewish believers in Antioch had been a gradual process, and finally it reached a breaking point, enough unstated tensions could have simply caused the need for a full-on public confrontation. As Bruce says, quote, "For aught we know, he may have remonstrated with Cephas privately before rebuking him publicly. But perhaps he would have said that, since the offense was public, the rebuke had also to be public," unquote. We have to understand how first Peter's vision of Acts 10, also 11, 1 through 16, demonstrated that via the sacrificial work of his son, God considers all human beings to be clean. No unnecessary impediments should have been placed before men and women from the nations in order for them to be evangelized and turn to God in repentance. Furthermore, the new non-Jewish believers needed to be welcomed into the fellowships of Jewish believers as full and equal members of God's people because of their expressed faith in Israel's Messiah. The sharing of a common meal was critical for establishing good faith and community with people in the first century world. But by separating themselves, the Jewish believers in Antioch, especially Peter, were not seeing that God's objective of all being welcome was being fulfilled. It is with this in mind that Paul made the accusation. If you, a Jew born and bred, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you insist that Gentiles must live like Jews? Galatians 2:14, New English Bible. What is this supposed to mean? Well, Paul rightly acknowledged Peter's background as a Jew, the Greek su iudaios huparkon. What did he mean by saying that he livest after the manner of Gentiles? King James Version. Furthermore, how are readers to understand the final clause? How the nations dost thou compelled to Judaize? Young's literal translation. As noted by Longenecker, Peter, living like a Gentile, is most frequently taken by Christian examiners in terms of him eating unclean things. Quote, the terms ethnikos and iudaikos refer to living according to Jewish and Gentile customs, particularly here with respect to the observance of the Jewish dietary laws, the former ignoring and the latter observing them, unquote. The significance of Paul's question in Galatians 2:14 can only be appreciated from the original Greek. Pos ta ethne anagkadzes iudaizein. Why do you compel the nations to Judaize? Green's literal version. Galatians 2:14 is the text of Scripture from which the common designation, the Judaizers, originates, per the false teachers or influencers who were leading the Galatians astray. Yet, by his usage of the verb iudaizo, Paul was making an important point to the Jewish believers in Antioch, which need not be overlooked. The BDAG lexicon defines this verb as to live as one bound by Mosaic ordinances or traditions, live in Judean or Jewish fashion. But what one considers to be Jewish customs or traditions, to be sure, had some variance among the first century branches of Judaism. Jewish people from the land of Israel or Judea would have had a much more stringent Torah halakha than Jewish people of the diaspora, generally. Perhaps the most significant usage of the verb iudaizo outside of Galatians is seen in the Septuagint rendering of Esther 8:17, where Bible readers see how, in every city and province, wherever the ordinance was published, wherever the proclamation took place, the Jews had joy and gladness, feasting and mirth, and many of the Gentiles were circumcised and became Jews. Iudaizon, for fear of the Jews, from Brenton's translation. The Greek verb iudaizo renders the Hebrew yahad, meaning to pose as a Jew or to embrace Judaism, the Kaler-Baumgartner lexicon. As Longenecker renders Galatians 2:14, if you, a Jewish believer, can live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel Gentile believers to become Jews? Word Biblical Commentary. Another important usage of the verb iudaizo appears in Josephus's account of the Jews fighting the Romans, and how a Roman named Metilius was spared from death because he promised to be circumcised and become a Jew. And thus were all these men barbarously murdered, excepting Metilius, for when he had entreated for mercy and promised that he would turn Jew and be circumcised, peritames iudaisein, and they saved him alive, but none else. Wars of the Jews 2, 454. The verb iudaizo, to Judaize, is something which tended to occur in instances or situations of coercion or force. Betts well summarizes the issue of Galatians 2:14, quote, "In Paul's view, it describes forcing one to become a Jewish convert," unquote. Hansen also comes close to this, detailing, quote, "The verb that the NIV translates to follow Jewish customs would be more accurately translated as to become Jews, for the Gentiles would have to do more than just follow a few Jewish customs. They would have to become Jews in order to have table fellowship," unquote. Anne McKnight further states, quote, "The term to follow Jewish customs, iudaizein, made me no more than to live like a Jew. However, I tend to agree with those who understand the term as converting to Judaism in the fullest sense," unquote. The answer to the problem caused by Peter separating himself from the non-Jewish believers to the Jewish believers was that the non-Jewish believers would have to become Jewish proselytes in order for unity to be restored. As Longenecker puts it, quote, "Instead of treating them as true believers in Jesus, his action would have resulted in their becoming converts to Judaism," unquote. This is something that Paul would have nothing to do with, as unity among God's people was not something to be achieved by one's ethnicity, economic status, or even gender. Galatians 3:28. Unity was to be founded on what Yeshua the Messiah had accomplished for everyone, in being sacrificed for human transgression and resurrected from the dead. Here, the issue of Judaizing is not so much placed at the feet of the influencers in Galatia, but at the feet of the Apostle Peter. While the influencers in Galatia no doubt wanted the new non-Jewish believers to undergo ritual conversion, what was Paul asking of Peter? What did Paul want Peter to think through that he perhaps had not considered via his inappropriate actions? When Paul accused Peter in the immediate clause prior that he lives in the manner of Gentiles, New King James Version, or huparchon ethnikos, what did he mean? Did he mean, as some have extrapolated it, you have discarded the Jewish laws and are living like a Gentile? Galatians 2:14, New Living Translation. Was Paul claiming that now that Peter had found Christ, the Mosaic Torah was now of no effect for either of them? Was it that Peter was now living like a Gentile, but in Galatians 2:14 was seen reversing his lifestyle and again living like a Jew by peer pressure from outsiders, meaning that he was not following the Torah and now was following it? Or was Paul making the observation that Peter's behavior and attitudes, though he was a Jew, were more consistent with that of pagan Gentiles? As the Goodspeed New Testament has it, you live like a heathen. Many consider Paul's remarks made to Peter that being a Jew versus being a Gentile are to be understood as living according to Jewish and Gentile cultural norms, in this case pertaining to the kosher dietary laws and/or ritual purity. From this point of view, Peter considered ritual purity, his being a Jew, to be more important than sitting down with his non-Jewish brothers and sisters and fellowshipping as one in the Lord. Among Messianic interpreters, some have partially concurred with this view, viewing Paul's remark to live like the Gentiles as regarding the table fellowship of the believers in Antioch, as opposed to the validity of kashrut, from which Peter withdrew. It has been suggested how Jews who did not follow a set of particular cultural expectations could be considered as though they were a Gentile. 1 QS 2, 4, and 5, Dead Sea Scrolls. Thus, when Paul told Peter that he was living like a Gentile, this would have been a phrase common to first century Jews where Peter would be associating with non-Jews at the table. Having done this, how then could Peter have reversed his actions and required the non-Jewish believers to somehow Judaize? While this would be one way of looking at Paul's comments to Peter in Galatians 2:14, I would suggest that Paul's remarks did not primarily concern Peter's observance of ritual purity and/or kashrut, but instead concerned Peter's behavior and motives. A better way of looking at Paul's rebuke to Peter, live like a Gentile, is to approach it from an ethical standpoint. The term ethnikos can pertain to nationhood foreign to a specific national group with focus on morality or belief from the BDAG lexicon. Note how Paul's accusation to Peter was that he was living like the nations. Yet, from a ritual standpoint, Peter clearly was not. Peter had separated himself to go join those who came from James, Galatians 2:11 and 12, who likely held to highly conservative views of the Torah and ritual purity. If anything, Peter was living like highly conservative, hyper purity conscious Jews. So how in doing this could Peter have actually been considered to be living as a pagan Gentile? Consider how Peter had adopted the same kind of attitude which the Gentiles at large held of the Jews, perhaps similar to how the Roman historian Tacitus claimed that the practices of the Jews were repulsive and disdainful. The Histories 5:5, 1 and 2. Paul publicly rebuked him. You, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews. Galatians 2:14, New American Standard. By separating himself to the Jewish believers in Antioch and not sharing table fellowship with the non-Jewish believers, a big gulf between them would have been created. And this is why Paul asked Peter the pertinent question, why do you compel the nations to Judaize? From Green's literal version. In Galatians 2:14, Paul could very well have been using some form of ironic rebuke to get Peter to reconsider his actions. Peter, in wishing to demonstrate an example as a good Jew to those who came from James, in actuality found himself living like a pagan Greek or Roman, who would tend to treat Jews with disgust. By his attitudes here, Peter had surely lost all moral authority as an apostle and representative of the pillars in Jerusalem. Galatians 2:9. He did not demonstrate this behavior toward his fellow Jewish believers, and instead failed to show generosity, hospitality, or a welcoming attitude toward his fellow non-Jewish believers. Peter, in attempting to be Jewish, was behaving no differently than a Gentile Greek or Roman and how he would treat a Jew. As Ben Witherington III points out for his extended observations on Galatians 2:1, throughout the Mediterranean, quote, competition was often the essence of such a culture, not least because it was believed that honor was a limited good, that it is in short supply, such that for one person to have it, another would have to be deprived of it, unquote. By separating himself from his fellow non-Jewish brethren in Antioch, Peter would definitely have found himself robbing his fellow believers of their self-respect and who they were as new persons in the Lord, and certainly be caught not acting in accordance with the truth of the gospel in a manner disrespectful of Yeshua's work. He treated them no differently than they, were they non-believers, would commonly have treated him. The Greco-Roman hostility toward the Torah practice of circumcision and the Jews who practiced it is well documented. Could it have been that Peter was acting in a reverse attitude toward uncircumcised, new, non-Jewish believers as they would have probably acted toward him prior to their salvation experience? I would paraphrase what Paul asked Peter in Galatians 2:14 as, how can you dare compel non-Jewish believers to convert to Judaism when you act like a pagan Gentile? Peter had no right by his actions to imply the necessity of proselyte conversion for the non-Jewish believers when he had ethically acted like a pagan. The aspects of to Judaize, Young's literal translation, in Galatians 2:14 here are seen as negative, as by his actions, Peter may have had no idea what he communicated to the non-Jewish believers in Antioch. Ironically, Peter may have not even been that consciously aware that by separating himself unto the Jewish believers, the only way that many of the non-Jewish believers may have thought that they could have fellowship with them was by going through ritual proselyte conversion and by becoming a member of the overly conservative, somewhat secluded Jewish community, which Paul himself, even though a loyal Pharisaic Jew, did not represent. Rather than having one group of people fellowshipping in one accord in Antioch, with their common identity being rooted in the Lord Yeshua and his completed work, Peter found himself instigating a schism with two groups, with the great travesty being that Peter had attitudes more like those of the pagans than his own Jewish people who were raised with a Torah ethic. Galatians 2:15. It is unfortunate that many Christians have taken Paul's words in Galatians 2:14 and misconstrued them as Paul being against all Jewish tradition for all time, separating his words from the actual scene in Antioch. If anything, Paul was against embedded Jewish tradition and attitudes which impeded the Torah's mandate for Abraham's blessing to reach out to all nations. Galatians 3:8. This, in Paul's mind, came before the rite of circumcision and took precedent. Of all the Jerusalem apostles who should have understood this, Peter should have. Peter, one of Yeshua's inner three disciples, could have fellowshipped with the non-Jewish believers in Antioch and told them all about the Messiah who they had come to believe in. He did not do this. Peter needed Paul to confront him and realize that what he communicated to his fellow non-Jewish brethren in Antioch was more important than what his fellow Jewish brethren from Jerusalem might see. Galatians 2:12. Peter could easily have gone back home to Jerusalem and explained his actions in Antioch to those who may have heard that he ate with Gentiles. Acts 11:18. Issues which would later be hammered out at the Acts 15 Jerusalem Council. But Peter would leave Antioch with no explanation for his actions of separation, but his actions. And that could cause some problems which Paul did not want to have to rectify. Paul wanted Peter to set a proper example. Paul explained this to the Galatians to demonstrate how Peter was in the wrong and how he did not want the Galatians' own times of fellowship to be divided between those who were overly conservative in their Torah observance. At the sake of splitting up the assembly and those who were new in faith and needed to be welcomed in, treated with respect, and certainly discipled in holy living. All right, so we're going to continue on with this. I did say this is a long study. We only have a few more pages to go. We're going to wrap this up with Galatians 2:11 through 14 application. As Josephus's record indicates, Wars of the Jews 743-45. The Jewish synagogues of Antioch attracted many of the locals into their ranks, who in turning away from Greco-Roman religion were widely integrated into the local Jewish community. This surely affected the makeup of the assembly of Messiah followers. So, while many of these non-Jewish believers were not formal Jewish proselytes, they were probably keeping some level of kosher, and the meal times between the believers, as is agreed by various Galatians examiners, did not serve non-kosher meat. At most, those in Antioch did not follow as high a level of kashrut as those who came from Jerusalem did. The real issue which caused the schism in Antioch by Peter separating himself to the Jewish believers was that Peter was actually fellowshipping with uncircumcised Greeks and Romans, Galatians 2:12. The issue was over disputed table fellowship scruples, over which the Jewish community itself was internally divided. In order for proper fellowship and communion to be restored, the non-Jewish believers would apparently have to Judaize, Galatians 2:14b, and become formal proselytes. And this was something the Apostle Paul would have nothing to do with. In the dialogue which ensued, Paul described to Peter how we are Jews by nature and not sinners from the nations. Galatians 2:15, author's rendering. Much of this had to do with the fact that having been reared with God's instruction, they should have known the sinful ways of the nations at large and known when they fell into some of the same negative attitudes the pagans at large demonstrated toward them as Jews. But what was considered to be the key issue here, which the Jewish believers in Antioch should have known about? Having been trained in the Torah's instruction their whole lives, knowing its principles of right and wrong, and knowing what God expected of them, what were Peter and those he separated to doing wrong? How did it relate to Jewish and non-Jewish relations in the body of Messiah? Much of it pertained to the attitudes of exclusivism, turning people away from the nations who were definitely seeking, and in promoting a spiritual culture which sought to minimize the inclusion of others from the outside, one which decisively skewed the Abrahamic mandate of being a blessing to others. Galatians 3:8. This is why Paul further asserted how justification was not to come ex ergon namu, but instead dia pistos Iesu Christou. While there are debates regarding this terminology which are beyond the scope of our examination here, ergon namu, or works of law, is probably Paul's equivalent of Maaseh HaTorah, appearing in 4Q MMT of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where the club rules of inclusion to the Qumran community were in view. Here likened unto ritual proselyte circumcision, meriting non-Jews true membership within God's covenant people. Quite contrary to this, true membership for anyone among the redeemed comes through the faithfulness of Yeshua the Messiah, or what is accessible by his obedience to the Father unto death for sinful humanity. Yet, knowing that a person is not justified by works of law, but through the faithfulness of Yeshua the Messiah, even we have believed in Messiah Yeshua, that we might be justified by the faithfulness of Messiah, and not by works of law, since by works of law will no flesh be justified. Galatians 2:16, author's rendering. Today, in segments of the Messianic community, we're experiencing some similar problems as those which manifested in Antioch. Many non-Jewish believers over the past several decades have expressed a great interest in their faith heritage in Israel's scriptures. They attend Messianic Jewish congregations, which have a fair number of Jewish people in attendance and in leadership. But these individuals, because they are not Jewish, often feel excluded. They do not feel ministered to personally the same way that they were in their previous church settings. nor do they often feel that their spiritual gifts and talents are properly used and appreciated. Simply because God chose them to be of another nationality, they are not often included. Perhaps the Jewish leadership of the congregation unintentionally acts like Peter and just inadvertently spends more time with the Jewish believers. But what message does this send to the non-Jewish believers? Are not all to be one in Messiah Yeshua? Galatians 3:28. How is this problem rectified in such Messianic congregations? Many non-Jewish believers simply get turned off to the Messianic movement and return to their previous church settings. Many endure the treatment of being second class because for them the rewards of being involved in the Messianic experience, even if they themselves are not treated as fairly as they think they should be, outweigh the disadvantages of having to do this alone in one's own home. But then, a few non-Jewish believers being drawn to things of Torah or things of Judaism seek acceptance beyond the Messianic Jewish synagogue. They start attending a non-Messianic synagogue, perhaps an Orthodox Jewish synagogue, and they find that they may be fully accepted as proselytes to Judaism. The disturbing thing about this is that often the non-Jewish proselyte may be accepted more heartily than he or she would have been accepted in the Messianic congregation. And of course, in order to become such a proselyte, saving faith in Yeshua must be renounced. We have the responsibility to make sure that all are welcomed into our Messianic congregations and synagogues. While the Jewish style of worship and procedure should be respected, it should not be to the extreme where entire groups of people are excluded from legitimate ministry outreach. Failure to do so, in some cases, has already encouraged apostasy from the Messiah. In his 2011 resource, The Holy Epistle to the Galatians, D. Thomas Lancaster fairly observes how, quote, in Antioch, Peter discovered an amazing community of believers where, in the midst of the believing Jewish community, God-fearing Gentile believers, the disciples of Paul and Barnabas, mingled freely. They worshiped with the Jewish believers. They kept the Sabbath and the festivals along with the Jewish believers. And they ate and drank with the Jewish believers at fellowship meals, at ritual meals, festival meals, and so forth. Not as guests in the synagogue or second-class citizens, but as brothers and sisters in the Messiah, unquote. The Apostle Peter's inadvertent action, for which he was seemingly quite sorry for at the later Jerusalem Council, Acts 15, 7-11, would have seen that the only way the non-Jewish believers to feel fully welcome and accepted among their Jewish peers was to seek proselyte conversion. Far from works of law being the entryway and identity focus of the body of Messiah, what the Messiah had done was to be the identity focus of the body of Messiah. Galatians 2:16. Lancaster goes on to recognize, quote, we have the same issue in the Messianic Jewish movement all the time. This is always the issue, and it is always the question. When Gentiles start doing Jewish things, it blurs those neat lines of distinction. Our problems in Messianic Judaism are not new problems. They are ancient problems, biblical problems, the same problems with which the disciples of the apostles and the apostles themselves struggled, unquote. In today's Messianic Jewish assemblies in the diaspora, there are mixed demographics of people. The answer of some, and we should think quite wrongly, has been to offer a method of conversion for non-Jewish believers to Messianic Judaism. And an overarching problem is that a complementarian ideology of differences first among people tends to prevail, as opposed to a more egalitarian ideology of common faith first. Alternatively, recognizing Paul's word that it is by Yeshua's faithfulness that men and women are regarded as justified and members of the company of redeemed, we should instead be facilitating congregations and communities of Messiah followers where a major reason why someone would be separate from another group of people is because someone might be sick and does not want to get others sick. There are indeed various differences and distinctions among Jewish and non-Jewish believers, men and women, rich and poor, etc. But separating from others because of ethnicity or nationality, people for whom Israel's Messiah died, was something which Paul had nothing to do with. Thankfully, I can say that I myself presently attend a Messianic Jewish congregation, which, while not perfect, there are no perfect congregations, does say that it is called to be a Messiah-centered, Spirit-empowered, disciple-making community that reveals the truth of Yeshua, the Jewish Jesus, to both Israel and the nations. We are committed to making Yeshua the Lord of our life, faith, and ministry. Our community seeks to be like the first Jerusalem congregation, where both Jew and non-Jew function as one new man, equal before God. Acts chapter 2. Many Messianic people, non-Jewish or even Jewish, do not have such a local faith community to which to belong. And perhaps quite sadly, circumstances similar to those in Antioch do not have those like Paul present to correct Peter when appropriate. All right, so I am sure that you were not expecting that level of detail regarding Galatians 2, 11 through 14, ranging from both the kosher issue as well as the issue of what it means to Judaize. But nevertheless, it is a very serious matter to be considered, and it is something which affects us today in the Messianic community. All right, so that concludes our theology roundup for today. Let me switch windows back really quickly. Okay. Okay, there we go. Yes, there we go. And once again, what we just went through has been taken from our ministry publication, the Messianic Kosher Helper. All right, so let's get into some news now. If you've waited this long, you can wait just a little bit longer. We do have some news to go through. We go through the news after the theology roundup, mainly because the news is, of course, time sensitive and it changes from day to day. We continue to be reminded that, number one, we need to be praying for peace, Israel, Gaza, the Middle East. Number two, be praying for peace, Russia and Ukraine. And then number three, be praying for reason and sanity to prevail here on the American home front. And we do have some stories involving both the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, and a few things here at home. All the stories I'm about to go through, these are things which I mainly encounter passively on social media. You'll be able to look at the links, read the articles, check out the different clips later today when this episode is archived at MessianicApologetics.net. All right, so our first story, this is from Charisma, yesterday, October the 29th. Home robots are here. Are we living in the last days of Revelation? Okay, a lot of us have seen, different things regarding AI. Now we're talking about robots. Here it talks about that there's a $20,000 humanoid robot available for pre-sale to do household chores. Now, this is, of course, just some of the natural extension of technology making human life presumably easier for people. But of course, this is what the Charisma article concludes. As technology races forward, the warnings of Scripture do echo louder than ever. Revelation speaks of a time when no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, and when a global system of control would rise through deception and power. While AI and robotics promise convenience, they also open the door to surveillance, manipulation, and dependency, unlike anything humanity has ever known. The merging of artificial intelligence, data collection, and human-like machines points to a world where privacy, autonomy, and even free will could be subtly eroded, preparing the stage for a system that knows, monitors, and controls all. Okay, that is the opinion of this article. But right now, guess what? A lot of us don't have $20,000 available at our disposal to go pre-order some robot who can clean house and cook our meals, etc. But where are we going to be in 10 years? I mean, I remember many years ago when personal computing became something far more common. And, most people, of course, including myself, went out and got a Windows 95 machine, and then later Windows 98, and then Windows XP and Windows 7. And why did we go to Windows? Because they were much more inexpensive than the Macintosh alternative. But of course, the Macintosh alternative, I have to say, much better, much more stable, much more secure operating system. But Macintosh knew, Apple Computer knew, if they wanted to get the market that Windows and Intel had, they had to bring the price of their machine down. And they did so first with using Intel processors. They don't use Intel processors anymore. Having a machine that could run Windows applications too, because particularly with things that were not for the Mac OS or different gaming things. And then later, with the introduction of iPhone and iPad, people would want a computer where all of their devices were integrated. And so now Windows and Mac, they're relatively in the same ballpark of pricing. But when we hear about robots, are we going to see the development of home robots along the same lines? Hard to say. Okay, from Open Source Intel yesterday, October the 29th, there's a 58-second clip here. J.D. Vance, the amount of territory the Russians are gaining is so small, and they're losing a lot of people in the process. The Ukrainians are suffering from a lot of problems. Indeed, this conflict, Russia and Ukraine, it's got to stop. This is just ended up in just a war of attrition, a stalemate. You've got a World War I type lines drawn. Nobody's really advancing or moving forward, moving ahead. It just needs to stop. It's not good for Russia. It's not good for Ukraine. It's not good for the world. The vice president recognizes that. And the question is, when is Vladimir Putin, more than anyone else, going to come to his senses and see this conclude? All right, so here is a clip which came across my feed on Instagram from Wild Olive Tree. That's Bruce Mejia. He is a strong supersessionist, anti-Zionist. He does not believe that the state of Israel was founded according to Bible prophecy. But here he criticizes the idea, you all can watch this in greater detail later. He criticizes the idea that Christian people should support the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And he also comes out strongly against Christian groups which have actually sent money to different Temple Mount faithful groups, presumably, who want to see the temple reconstructed. Now, I really don't know of any, large Christian groups who are getting behind economically to go support the reconstruction of the temple. I do know some people who are behind finding the right red heifer to be sacrificed in order to see the Levitical priesthood come about. But for myself, I'm much more of a hands-off, let prophecy take its course, and we will respond as the body of Messiah appropriately. But what's interesting about this clip here is he does ask the question, do Christians need to help found the third temple? Because, you know, when we look at the temple in Thessalonians, that's a temple that the Antichrist is going to come and desecrate. Now, that is what's so fascinating about what Bruce Mejia says here, because one would think that if he were supersessionist, the church is the new Israel, he believes that the ethnic Jewish people have no real future in God's eternal plan, that the state of Israel was founded by, you know, Zionist, Luciferian bankers, you know, that kind of thing. Well, why would you even see the reconstruction of the third temple, even if it's for the anti-Messiah or Antichrist? That would imply at least that God is still working in the land of Israel on the Temple Mount, at least according to a predetermined prophetic plan. And so what if the third temple is built for the anti-Messiah, Antichrist to reveal himself? That does concern the ethnic Jewish people, the ethnic people of Israel who are in the Holy Land today, who are in the state of Israel today. So you are kind of saying that there is something futuristic, prophetic about the reconstruction of the third temple, even if it's for the revealing of the beast. And that would necessarily imply that various promises which you have said have been transferred from Israel to now the church of some new Israel probably have some future level of fulfillment for the people of ethnic Israel. So it's kind of interesting when you decompile what some of these internet supersessionists are saying. He's still widely adhering to some kind of a futuristic premillennial prophecy scenario. Won't be the last time. We probably have to note what the Wild Olive Tree channel is saying. Okay, here's an interesting one. This is from Charisma yesterday, talking about the award that President Trump received from South Korea. Trump was given a replica golden crown along with the Grand Order of Mugongwa. I totally mispronounced that. I apologize. The highest civilian honor in South Korea. So here you see Trump receiving this award. Now, the White House noted how this was the first occasion for a U.S. president ever to receive the honor. Now, you can read this article in greater detail, but you scroll down, and what does this article from Charisma point out? Revelation 6:2 tells us, and I looked, and there was before me a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went forth conquering that he might overcome. There's no question that Trump has gone out conquering, attempting to bring world peace. Could this latest award conquest, at the very least, be a symbol of things yet to come? Revelation 9:7 also reads, the shape of the locust was like horses prepared for battle. On their heads were something like crowns of gold, and their faces were like faces of men. And so, of course, while this article says, well, we don't quite know what the future is going to involve, this is kind of interesting. And of course, there are going to be people who, and I've noted them as they've come across my social media feeds, there are going to be people who conclude that Trump is possibly the beast or the Antichrist. At the very least, there are going to be people who conclude that Trump is laying the groundwork for the arrival of the beast or the Antichrist. So we'll wait and see, of course. All right, from open source intel yesterday, October the 29th. Okay, here's a story. This is more on the Russian nuclear torpedo. President Putin announced that Russia successfully tested its nuclear power and nuclear-armed unmanned underwater vehicle, the 2M39 Poseidon. Okay, and this shows you more of a diagram of what it's capable of. It's detonated off of the coast of an enemy, and then it produces a radioactive tidal wave that pushes radioactive seawater on enemy cities, on enemy coastlines. So 100 megaton warhead detonated, triggering 1,600 feet tsunami of radioactive seawater. Yeah, in some ways, that's worse than detonating a nuclear warhead over a city, because you can damage a lot more people with that kind of a weapon. Now, how accurate is that? How inaccurate is that? It's bad, is what it is. It's very bad. Okay, a few stories about Israel, Gaza. Here we have from open source intel. Netanyahu visits U.S. base in Kiryat Gat. But here we have the next story, also from open source intel. This is from yesterday afternoon, October the 29th. Pakistan will potentially de-weaponize Hamas. So this international group, which supposedly going to be peacekeepers in Gaza, Pakistan, Pakistan's Secretary for Information, Barrister Daniel Khajouri. Let me be very clear. This is not about fighting anyone. This is not about taking sides in any conflict. Pakistan's role in Gaza, if we go, will be to de-weaponize Hamas and make sure there are no attacks. And then scroll down just a little bit. He also mentions that Pakistan is pro-Palestine and that Pakistani troops deployed to Gaza will need parliamentary consensus. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen with the peacekeepers in Gaza, but what always strikes me about Pakistan possibly being involved, and we haven't really heard about Pakistan before that much in the Mideast peace process. Pakistan is, of course, a nuclear power. That's what concerns me. Okay, from the Epoch Times, yesterday, October the 29th. This is an opinion piece. Signs of a weakened Xi Jinping. And of course, President Trump just concluded a visit to Southeast Asia where he did meet with Xi Jinping, the Chinese president. I think that his days are numbered. He will either be put out to pasture or simply sidelined in one way or another, said Stephen Mosher, researcher and author of the book, Bully of Asia, Why China's Dream is the New Threat to World Order. Okay, so these are, of course, opinions. We know that Xi Jinping has stayed in office longer than some of his predecessors. And U.S.-Chinese relations, Chinese-Western relations, they've come and gone. But, of course, right now, the Chinese government is probably the only major leverage the West has over Vladimir Putin to get him to halt this Russia-Ukraine war. But the Chinese, as we know, they are one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. They are looking at things long-term in terms of their influence over the world. And many have acknowledged that the Chinese are a threat in some way or another, at least economic, to the West. And prophetically, people frequently, whether it's accurate or not, they frequently tend to associate the 100 million man army in the book of Revelation as being Chinese. All right, so here we've got more from the Tucker Carlson situation. There's a 1 minute, 9 second clip, but this is from the X channel, Now the End Begins. And the commentary is, Tucker Carlson is a lost man who hates the Jews and despises the nation of Israel. He knows next to nothing about the Bible, literally, and yet feels the freedom to critique what it teaches. How much further will he fall? So I point this out because there are a lot of people right now, and you know I love you, but there are a lot of people right now in the Messianic community who they have no idea what is going on with Tucker Carlson. Are you aware of that? They have no idea about him platforming Nick Fuentes and some of the things he has said about how he considers Christian Zionism to be a brain virus. And one of the reasons why we have gone 5 times a week with Messianic Insider and we just don't deal with theology is so that people can know what is going on like this, which affects our society today. It affects young people on the conservative right, and it's going to affect our mission in the world one way or the other. And here's another response to Tucker Carlson. This is from Aish.com. So these are mainly Orthodox Jews. This is Instagram. It flips back and forth, but here they simply say, Tucker Carlson's massive platform has been giving space to anti-Semitism, from hosting extremists like Nick Fuentes to questioning the loyalty of American Jews. His influence spreads dangerous ideas to millions. Okay, so this is a very serious situation, and I recommend that if you're just hearing about it, go watch or listen to yesterday's episode. Take a look at some of those links. People are responding to Tucker Carlson platforming Nick Fuentes, who says that he thinks that Hitler was great, Stalin, I admire Stalin, and a lot of people are royally pissed off about it. They truly are, and they should be. Okay, we've got 10 more stories to go through. I'll try to go through this a little quickly. All right, from Open Source Intel, October the 29th, Qatari foreign minister, we are monitoring the challenges faced by the ceasefire in Gaza yesterday, and this is expected. None of us expected the Gaza ceasefire to not have some start and stops. It was going to be beset with various challenges, and here at least the one on the Qatari side recognizes it. From Open Source Intel yesterday, and this is reposting something that President Trump posted on his Truth Social platform. Breaking, U.S. President Donald Trump said that he instructed the Department of War to start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis. Now, here he says, because of the tremendous destructive power, and of course, we know that the Russians have been testing some weapons. I hated to do it, but had no choice. Russia is second, and China is a distant third, but will be even within 5 years. Because of other countries' testing programs, I've instructed the Department of War to start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis. So basically, Trump is coming from the perspective, hey, if Russia's going to test some of these weapons, if China is building up its nuclear arsenal to be on par with ours, we're going to at least have some kind of parity in terms of testing American nuclear weapons. Is this upsetting? Yes. Is it disturbing? Yes. Does it fall within the rubric of wars and rumors of wars? Yes. But can it be stopped? Can it be curtailed? Yes. Okay, from Open Source Intel, there's an 11-second clip. This is from last night, October the 29th. U.S. President Donald Trump meets Chinese President Xi in South Korea, which is their first meeting in 6 years. They have had some phone calls, they have exchanged letters, but not met in person. And here you see a follow-up to that last night. Open Source Intel, China's President Xi appreciates President Trump's great contribution to the Gaza ceasefire. I do believe that President Trump wants to try to work with the Chinese as best he can. Here's another story. This is a summary from Visegrad 24, October the 30th, this morning at 2:11 a.m. There's a 1-minute, 3-second clip. Trump just met with Xi for the first time in 6 years, and some of the matters which were discussed: U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports, the dispute over Chinese rare earth exports to the U.S. China will resume large-scale purchases of U.S. soybeans. China will engage in direct talks with NVIDIA regarding chip restrictions. U.S. will postpone its probe into Chinese shipbuilding. So these are mainly economic things which the two leaders have agreed on. All right, so Open Source Intel, this is in response to the Trump Truth Social post. This is from this morning, October the 30th. Trump, if they're going to test, we have to test. But here Trump says, and there's a 50-second audio clip, denuclearization would be a tremendous thing, and it's something we're actually talking to Russia about, and China would be added to that if we do something. Yeah, we do know that Donald Trump is wanting to present himself as the peace president. He wants there to not only be bilateral denuclearization with Russia, but also denuclearization with China. Okay, now this is from Visegrad 24. This is more on the talks between Trump and Xi Jinping. Announced a tariff reduction. Okay, soybeans, rare earths. But here, he also said the two sides agreed to work together on a peaceful resolution in Ukraine. Xi Jinping expressed willingness to continue cooperating with Trump to create a solid foundation for China-U.S. relations and a favorable environment for the development of both countries. According to Xi, China's development and revitalization go hand in hand with Trump's goal to make America great again. Okay. Now, hopefully, we can see a level of peaceful coexistence and cooperation between the world's superpower and the world's emerging superpower. And we don't have to see, open conflict. Okay, so our next story, I just had to refresh the window. This is from Open Source Intel, and there's a 1 minute, 21 second clip from Fox. Trump on Russia-Ukraine war. Okay, this is from this morning, October the 30th. Sometimes you have to let them fight. Crazy. There's not a lot more we can do. It doesn't affect China. It doesn't affect us. Now, we've seen these kinds of sentiments before. The thought that, hey, we've done the best we can. We want to see peace, Russia, Ukraine, but are they just going to have to fight it out and then finally decide among themselves that, hey, we want to end this. This is pointless. This is a situation which changes day to day, but we as God's people need to pray for peace, Russia and Ukraine. Okay, and two more stories. Open source intel. This is from today, October the 30th, 10:36 a.m. Prime Minister Netanyahu, so Israel, Gaza. Israel has received via the Red Cross the remains of 2 deceased hostages, which were handed over to an IDF and ISA force inside the Gaza Strip. They will be transferred to Israel, where they will be received in a military ceremony with the participation of the IDF chief rabbi. So who knows how long it's going to take for all of the hostages, all of those who have perished on the Israeli side in this conflict, to see their remains returned to Israel. This was expected to be what would take the longest amount of time. And we're going to close with this story, which came from Charisma, came today. Third Temple countdown. U.S. Congress introduces resolution backing Israel's holiest site. So you can read this article in detail later on, but here you see Congresswoman Claudia Tenney of New York spearheaded the measure calling for equal access for Christians, Jews, and Muslims at the sacred location. In a recent episode of the End Time Show discussing this historic moment, Vince Stegall said, "We think everyone in the world should know that a third temple is coming according to scripture. That's just before the second coming of Jesus Christ." Okay, so here you see that the resolution emphasizes that the Temple Mount is the holiest site in Judaism, while also echoing its importance to all 3 Abrahamic faiths. It reaffirms Israel's control over Jerusalem, echoing President Trump's Peace for Prosperity plan and the Abraham Accords, which support freedom of worship for all faiths. Okay, now, there's, of course, a lot of discussion in prophecy circles regarding the abomination of desolation. Does there need to be a third temple reconstructed or not? I am inclined in that direction, but I do believe that a minimal interpretation for the abomination of desolation would require the construction of a tabernacle as existed on the Temple Mount prior to the reign of King Solomon. During the reign of King David, the tabernacle was up on Mount Moriah. What this article highlights is because I know many people think that the Dome of the Rock needs to be destroyed and scraped, and then the third temple needs to be built in its place. If that were the intention of religious Jews, it would have been done back in 1967. It would have taken place already. Instead, the emphasis you see here by this resolution in Congress is that the Temple Mount, holiest place in Judaism, but it's sacred to all the three Abrahamic faiths. And indeed, what you would expect to see if the third temple is going to be reconstructed per end-time prophecy, you'd expect to see it built right alongside of the Dome of the Rock as a symbol of ecumenical unity and cooperation. That's what you would expect to see. So things are definitely getting interesting. And today we had a very long episode, but I did let you know about that in advance. Tomorrow, we're planning to also have a long episode, and we are discussing matters which you have asked me to talk about. Galatians 2, Paul confronts Peter in Antioch, and tomorrow we'll have another similar discussion, a passage which a lot of Messianic people definitely struggle with. As always, on behalf of Outreach Israel Ministries and Messianic Apologetics, I would like to sincerely thank you for your ongoing prayers, encouragement, and support for all of our ministry efforts. If you have not, please do visit my website, messianicapologetics.net. There you can access a wide number of free articles, frequently asked questions entries. You can look into some of the back issues of Outreach Israel News, back episodes of Messianic Insider, different McKee moment shorts, etc. All of our various adventures over the years. And please, if you have not, do thumbs up or heart this live stream, as it will help give us more exposure on the different social media platforms. We'll see you again tomorrow with another episode of Messianic Insider. Until then, may God bless you, shalom, and take care.